Hello, my name is Nurin Willis, and this is CEWL Schools. So this is going to be all about how we take our intersectional identities, LGBTQ, race, class, that our students bring into the classroom and how we make them as welcoming and as home-like and as safe for all of our students as possible. So this is our very first episode, so thank you for joining us. And we've got a really special topic to talk about today, and it is books. I know you've heard a lot about books, but specifically I want to talk about school libraries because they are so essential for our students, for our teachers, for our schools to be good, safe, happy places for kids and for our kids to learn and grow, learn about each other and themselves. So I have a very, very special guest today, and I'm going to bring her in and allow her to introduce herself. So let's bring her to the stage.
Hi, I'm Loni Lewis. I am a middle school librarian. I use she, her pronouns, and middle schoolers are my favorite people. We were talking about this a little bit before the chat started, but people were always like, how can you handle that age group? And I love them because they're totally honest. So if they say something really mean, I don't mind because I'm a grown adult. But if they say something really nice, they really, really mean it. So
Absolutely.
I love them for that.
Listen, middle school was not for me, but I love the folks who it is for because somebody has to do it, and the people who love it really love it, and that's fantastic.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I was going to say too, in addition to being a middle school librarian, I'm also a part of the South Carolina Association of School Librarians and their inaugural Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Share. I'm in my second term, so that is really exciting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so this is for the South Carolina Education Association's Center for Educational Wellness and Learning. It's all about helping educators learn how to be better educators because we're all trying to learn and grow all the time, and the world has changed very quickly. So, we have to stay on it, and we have to talk to each other. We have to have these conversations. So, big part of the reason, if y'all are not aware, that we've brought Loni in is because last week, there was some disappointing news for South Carolina and freedom of education and the freedom to learn and to read. Do you want to tell everybody about what happened?
Definitely. Our current superintendent of education, Ellen Weaver, sent a letter to the South Carolina Association of School Librarians, which I will hereafter refer to as SCEA because it sounds a lot cuter. So we have been trying to meet with her since before she was elected, honestly, and have never heard from her in those ways at all. She sent a letter to our organization, basically severing our ties immediately. So the South Carolina Department of Education and SCEA are no longer partnering. And some of the reasons this is so stressful for us as librarians is that we don't have a librarian in the Department of Education. SCEA has done a lot of the work to create our new ADEPT performance standards. We've worked on a lot of the collection things. And so we really are the librarian voice for the Department of Education. And although the letter says that they will still communicate with us, I'm not sure how that looks yet because literally all communication has been passed through SCEA. Some of the immediate ramifications were we have regional workshops in the fall where in 4 different regions of the states, librarians can come together and do professional development, hear from the State Department, hear from the University of South Carolina, which is where the library school is. Those were canceled immediately, except for the one in the Midlands. So if you live in the Midlands, you still can go to one, but most of the rest of us do not have the ability to do that. There's a lot of other potentially bad repercussions, but the main reasons that were stated in the letter were that it was implied that we are anti-parent, which is very frustrating because the majority of librarians are also parents. So how can you be against yourself? So that part's very frustrating. And then it also talks about how we, and this is the quotes are from the letter, how we talk about censorship, and that is not something that exists. I know one of our librarians was invited to the Recruitment and Retention Task Force for Educators in the state and spoke about some of our members' personal experiences as librarians facing vitriol from the public, from legislators. And so to be denied that these were actual experiences happening to librarians and that we are blowing this whole censorship thing out of proportion is very frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know, I mean, we rely on librarians, we rely on the libraries. I mean, it's just such an excellent resource. If you have not been in a school library since you were in school and it's maybe been decades, they are so much more than just, a place to go check out books, which is, I know a lot of my students, that is their safe space. That is their happy place. That's their, I go to lunch, I go hang out. It's quiet, it's calm. It's one of the few places in a lot of schools, like my high school, very large, a lot of students. The library, the calm, safe, happy place. Librarians are wonderful. They're not giving them homework. So it's a lot easier to connect there. Those are such important relationships for sure.
I think too, one of the things, and being at middle school, especially, I'm one of the only teachers that they have for all 3 years. So I see my students on a regular rotation with their teachers. So it's funny, all of the 8th grade teachers are like, they say their favorite place in the whole school is the library. And I'm like, that's just, they're familiar with me because they know the routines and the procedures, and the spectrum of kids that come to be in my library is really interesting because yes, you have the nerds, but then you have other kids too. Like I had this group of boys last year that were the troublemakers. And so whenever they had like big school-wide events, they're like, can we go hang out in the library? And I remember last year, the assistant principal came in and was like, are they in trouble? And I'm like, no, they asked to come in here because they knew that they could still like talk to each other and socialize, but they weren't going to be policed in any way. But they also weren't acting out of turn because they knew that I was cool with them being there. So
right, absolutely.
Definitely a great third space for our students.
Absolutely. No, I mean, there's not always anywhere to go when you're a student, if you're not in class or if you don't want to be around everybody in the school all the time. It's like, where else can you go?
Yeah. And I will bring up, I know I sent a link before, the new HRC report of the state of queer youth in schools in America really came out. And one of the statistics I saw the American Library Association posted that I really loved was that I forget what the percentage of students that felt safe in school was. It was way lower than it should be. But the percent of queer youth that usually or always felt safe in their school library was almost 9 out of 10. And that I feel like it's a really positive number for me personally. Not that I'm going to give my, but it felt really good. And
I actually have it right here. And it says almost half, so 46.1% of LGBTQ plus youth, including over half, so 53.9% of transgender and gender expansive youth reported feeling unsafe in at least one school setting. So there's multiple school settings, but in at least one. But 88.7% reported that they usually or always feel safe in the school library, which is that's incredible. That doesn't happen in schools. Like schools are, they're chaotic places, like not because of anything that anybody's doing wrong, but they're chaotic. And so the fact that especially LGBTQ plus youth, especially the kids who need it the most, feel safe there, it speaks volumes. I didn't mean that as a library pun, but I'm gonna take it.
It works. I'll take it too. And so I was reminded of that this week. And so I have a poster up in the library, which feel free to share the beautiful picture if you want. It's by this awesome company called Stick Together, and the image was created by a librarian named Kelsey Bogan, and it's cool because it's a pixel art, and so the students create it together. And so I don't tell them what the image is at first, and it has like, in letter A, put the pink sticker, and so they fill out the whole thing. So this has been on my library wall for the past 3.5 years. And this was my 6th graders' first week in the library. And I probably had over half of the classes, I had at least one kid come up and be like, I really like your Pride poster, and so like they recognized that this was a place where they could belong, and they were really open to talking to me about like, do you have any books about Pride? And so just it was a good feeling. And so I hope I'm one of the 9 out of 10.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's so crucial because our kids don't necessarily know who they can talk to, who they can feel comfortable and safe with. And it's important because they spend so much time at school, and they're around so many other kids and they hear things, and it can be really, I mean, it's tough. Being a teenager is tough. It has always been tough. And then now you have social media and everybody has a camera, and it's just, I don't know how they do it. It could not be me. I can say that much for sure.
I did have a student a couple years ago who were like, I bet it was really cool going to school back in the day. And I was just like, okay, thanks for making me feel old. But yeah, all we had was like AOL Instant Messenger, and it was in its infancy then. So
yeah, no, they're like shocked when we talk about like, I had to use nothing but textbooks. Like, I didn't have any of these resources that y'all have. Like, we were doing research projects. It's a trip to the library to find some relevant books. And that's, and that's what I know a lot of us remember. But now libraries get to do so much more in ways that I think are really great, because, we have so many other resources. So there can be more books that kids can access that can really help expand their view of the world and of themselves. And I know that that's so important, especially if you don't necessarily see yourself all the time in the world around you, in your school, even in your family. And that can be really tough.
And that's definitely been a fun, just as a librarian, that's been a fun thing for me, is like, we talk a lot about how we don't really have big reference books anymore, because as soon as they're published, they're out of date. And we have so many online databases that we get to use instead. So now I get to like really intentionally curate my nonfiction collection to be stuff that kids want to read. It's not for research, it's for reading. And so that's just, it's more fun to buy those kind of books. Yeah,
I mean, it's as a history teacher, I know that those textbooks, because they're 10, 15, 20 years old, or when they're finally approved, that everything is changing all the time. It's impossible to keep that going. And so it's wonderful that we have all these resources and that we have all these ways that we can share with kids. But I know that, like, as a teacher, I could not share all of the resources that the library gives them access to if I did not have my school librarian, if I did not have them really keeping things running, because y'all do so much for us, and it's so important, and it's easy to forget sometimes. But I feel like last week, that letter really was such a good reminder of how important y'all are, and we can't afford to lose you, and our kids can't afford that either.
I definitely, when I showed it to teachers at my school, they were struck, like, oh no. And it was also kind of a feeling of like, who's next?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that kind of moment hit as well, for sure. I also, like, it's very frustrating to just, I think this is another thing that I've been sharing with all my students during orientation, and I tell them, surprise, was in the library a lot as a student. I'm not an outside person, so it's like, oh, it's recess, I'm in the library, which makes it very hard for me to turn anyone away during recess, because I'm like, oh yeah, outside's terrible, no, don't go there. But I think one of the other things that people don't always realize, and that I tell the students every year now, is that we have a master's degree in library and information science. So our qualifications are automatically higher than teachers. Like, a lot of teachers do have master's degrees, but we have to have that just to start our position. So one of the things that's frustrating, I know we're going to be segueing into a lot of the challenge stuff, is when people are like, well, how did these books get into libraries? And it's like, my degree literally included courses on children's literature, young adult literature, collection development. So how you purchase your collection, how you catalog your collection. So I actually do have a background in how to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's been really interesting for me, because I've looked at some of the topics that are challenged, and we talk a lot about the LGBTQ plus stuff and the race stuff, but some of it is just hard conversations. It's violence, it's death, it's grief. But our kids experience those things, and they need to know that they're not alone in experiencing that. They need to know that other people have been there and survived it. And, I asked my students recently what their favorite story was, any kind of story. So I told them it could be a video game, it could be, a YouTube channel, it could be anything, their favorite story. But the most common response I got was The Hate U Give. And it was because they related to that story and they felt seen. And I know that that's a very challenged book, but it's like, if that's your life, then that's your life. And you should be allowed to see yourself in literature. And just because it's uncomfortable, maybe, that's where the growth comes from, is that discomfort. And those kids love to be able to feel like they are part of something.
So I'm about to blow your mind because so funny aside, I taught a lot of the students that Nurin teaches now. And I had at my school, I used to work at the College of Charleston at their library before I moved over. So I still had some associations there. When College of Charleston did their college reads programs with the Hate You Give, I received over 100 extra copies after they had finished distributing them to students. So I gave them to all of my 8th graders one year. And I wasn't really that worried about it because most of their parents, when they saw it, they're like, "Oh, that baby's reading a thick book," because it's,
There
it's
you
a
go.
hefty tome.
Yeah.
And I was like, I told the kids, like even for me as an adult, the first chapter has a little bit of cursing where you're like, "Oh, dang," but then it kind of backs off a little bit. But if you tell the kids there's cursing in the first chapter, they're just going to want to read it more. And then they're going to go and read a book that's almost 400 pages. And that's awesome. So, I might have contributed to some of those kids loving that book.
I don't doubt it one bit because, and because that's part of it is that exposure that they get from librarians. They might not go in a library and choose something without that librarian to help guide, to help them go, hey, this might be something you're interested in. Hey, and I see it in my own school library, how curated it is so that kids can very easily find something that may interest them or something that speaks to them and their lived experiences, because we need to be honoring those experiences, even when they're hard and maybe especially when they're hard.
I had a great conversation during back to school night. I had a lot of parents come in with their kids to the library at this back to school night, which was great. It always varies because since I don't have a rostered class except for a small news team, there's not a reason they have to come to the library, but a lot of them wanted to this year. And I even had a parent who was like, she was really impressed with the collection because she's like, it's not like just all of the old fuddy-duddy books we had when I was a kid. Like, this library looks like my children and all of these children. And so I think even though in publishing the numbers are still extremely skewed, there is more available than there used to be when we were students.
Yeah, for sure.
Populations, and a good librarian will make sure that those make them into the library, because that's one of the things that we talk about is you can buy books all day, but if you don't either present these books to students through book talks or on display or in some other way, if you own the book and it's not moving, what's the point?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think one of the things that I find really fascinating, and I use this quote with my classes today because I know after seeing those stories, and other ones chose other sort of very difficult stories that you may not think of as being your favorite story, but there's just this excellent James Baldwin quote that I shared with them that they really appreciated. And it's, you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. And it's just like, that's such a beautiful way to be able to look at pain and look at hurt, to say this connects me to people. So instead of viewing it as a negative, as, we all have pains, they may all be different and different levels and for different reasons, but we all feel those things, and we can't look away from the bad things just because it's hard, and that's what I'm afraid we're really doing here.
It is. And I always, whenever we talk about these kind of things, I have to bring Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop into the conversation. Librarians love to quote her because she has this quote about how books can act as windows and mirrors and also sliding glass doors. So you have that effect of the mirror, where if a book reflects your life, that's so wonderful. That's, I think, one of the harmful things about book banning is when you ban books about certain experiences, you're telling that student that you're not valued, that you shouldn't be this way. But so books can also be windows, so you can look into somebody else's world and identify with them. But then books can also be sliding glass doors where you can open the door and walk into another world and experience it without actually leaving your room necessarily. I was thinking about, I don't know if you've read this book, but one of my favorite books that I've read in the past few years is Darius the Great Is Not Okay. And I could not be any less like that main character, except for the fact that we both love tea. But I fell in love with this character and identified with him on such a personal level that even though we are completely different people, it was just interesting. And me, especially being an adult, it's fun. I read so much fiction for young people, but I was still just I really identify with this this 17-year-old in this book, and that's beautiful to me. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think too that quote you shared is so important, because building that empathy and that understanding of people around them. Again, the world is the world. And our jobs as educators, as librarians, as all of these things, is not to decide what they get to learn, what they get to read. It's to share as much as possible, And for me, when I see these sorts of back and forths, it makes me just want to share more things. It makes me want to open up more information, and including, and maybe even especially, things that I don't necessarily personally agree with, because it's not my job to tell these kids what to think or what to believe. It's just to try to help teach them to be kind, and to mostly to themselves, because teenagers are really bad at that. And there's a mental health crisis. We know that. We know there's a mental health crisis. School districts are suing social media companies because of the negative impacts of those apps, which, that's not really relevant here, but it is important when we look at what they need, because they need to connect with each other, they need to connect with themselves, and they need to feel good. And books are such an incredible way to do that, because we know TV and movies and all of these things are not always the most healthy, ways to learn about the world. And I know I don't want kids just like Googling everything, because they're not very good at media literacy when it comes to knowing what is real and what is not.
Speaking as a librarian, they're really bad, and one of the worst things ever. So I get very strict about curating sets of databases and be like, these are the sources you will use for this paper. Because at middle school, we're not really at the developmental mindset to be evaluating the internet at large. We might have been when we had less internet, but it's just not there right now.
Sure.
And so all of the students, when they research something, and I'm like, well, what's the source? Google. That's not the source. It literally came up on the results page, and you're just quoting the results page of Google, and that's not a source. So let's go ahead over to our nice South Carolina Discus databases, and let's find something else.
Yes, I was teaching current events last year, and a lot of it, I focused a lot on media literacy, because trying to teach current events in this day and age feels impossible, because it's just constantly moving. And so for me, my main goal was, if you're paying attention to what's happening in the world, I just want you to be able to evaluate, is it a good source? Is this, what are they, how biased is it? All of those things that are so important for critical thinking skills, because they need those skills now more than ever, because this is not, the olden days where you're going to work on a factory line and you're just going to do repetitive things all day, every day. That's not the world that we live in anymore. And I tell my kids, because especially when I was teaching freshmen, they didn't really care about media literacy, but I was like, y'all, it's not just, knowing the news. It's not getting scammed. I don't want you to give your entire life savings to somebody that you thought was, I know somebody got scammed. I'm not gonna call anybody out because that feels mean, but people are getting scammed left, right, and center. Yeah. Even people who, I found a guy who specifically hacks scammers' cameras in other countries and talks to them. He got scammed.
Yeah.
So he calls out scammers for a living, essentially, and even he got scammed. It can happen to literally anybody, and it's we're trying to prepare them for that world, and it's tough.
Yeah. I was my mom just yesterday was did you hear about these children using litter boxes in classrooms? And I was like, Mom, that was debunked 6 months ago. How are you just now getting to this? And she's like, you're sure? And I was like, yes, I'm a librarian. I'm very sure that is not fact. Thank you.
I mean, but those are the things, those attention grabbing headlines, and the truth doesn't matter. You use certain words, and it's just, and one of the things that I find really funny is this idea that any of these things are a war on parents, because, well, for a few reasons. One, I don't know a single educator who doesn't want more input and a better relationship, more conversation with parents, but also what parents are we listening to and supporting? Because all of the time there are two sides at the very least, and I don't think it's my job to make these decisions about what your child can learn in those sorts of ways. And if one parent says no for everybody, what about all the rest of those parents? And that's so important when we look at schools. I know the one I teach at, and the one, we teach different school demographics, but those kids, their parents, when I was teaching current events, wanted to make sure that I was teaching everything. I'm teaching African-American studies now. They want to make sure that I'm teaching them a good, accurate, complete history that will actually help them understand the world that they live in, because we're not there to teach them fantasy. We're not there to teach them about the world we wish we had. We're there to help them learn about the world that we actually have now.
I do, that whole argument is so disingenuous too, because a lot of times, a lot of these challenge cases, so the one in Beaufort, and now that it's officially public, 93 books have been challenged in the district that I teach in. They're like, we're not listening to parents, but these parents never came to talk to us in the first place. So if you, it's funny, a lot of the books that are on our list in our county, we looked and we're like, oh, that book's old. I can't believe I haven't gotten rid of it yet. Like, so many of these books are so old. And like, I didn't even know I only have 2 books from the list in my library, and neither of them I purchased. And one of them is book 3 in a series. And I realized that book 1 is missing. And I'm like, how did I not already read this book? Because I'm not going to go back and buy book 1 if nobody's reading it anyway. So I'm like, a lot of these conversations, if the parent had just come and talked to their librarian, might have been circumvented, because we could have been like, oh, actually, I could read this book just based on the fact that it's old.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I was talking to one of my friends who's a TA in a elementary school library, and we were talking about how, they don't have the kinds of books that you hear about in the news, and that parents already come to them about issues. And, they come to them about the issues that are more expansive, are not topic related, but they're just, hey, my kid found this book really scary, and I just wanted to double check if it's like fully age appropriate, or, if they're, because that's what matters. Kids being uncomfortable, like, that's hard to be uncomfortable, but that's also a part of life. And that's not a good reason to not expose them to stuff, because then they're just going to get exposed to it much later and have way less capacity to be able to handle it. And that's the last thing we want.
Or they're going to see it on their phone, and it's going to be way worse. Like, let's be real, like, most of my students have a phone in their pocket, and I'm sorry, most of what they're going to find on that phone is going to be more extreme than what's in a book. Also, what's appropriate? Age appropriate is one of my least favorite phrases. I prefer the phrase age relevant, because appropriate can look really different depending on the child. So I've been talking to some people about how the designation of young adult is a designation that, first of all, didn't exist until fairly recently. I don't have the exact date. We learned it in my young adult literature class. But, for a long time, there were just children's books and adult books. There wasn't like a dividing line. And so it's a fairly new distinction, like, in the history of literature and publishing. And it technically covers ages 12 through 18, which is most of middle school and all of high school. So 12-year-olds are very different.
Right.
18-year-olds are very, within that single age, they're very different. And then if you look from 12 to 18, that's hugely different. So something that I always find interesting is, a lot of times I feel like parents are really concerned, but I'll have kids that come and they'll start reading a book and they'll bring it to me and they're like, Miss Lewis, this is not appropriate. And I'm like, I'm sad that it's not appropriate for you, but luckily we have thousands of other books. And so I find that kids are actually really good at self-censoring. I had another student this week. Oh God, I love this. So she was reading a book she bought from home, and was telling her friend, like, oh, I got to give it to you. You got to read it. She's like, it's so good. And there's all this relationship drama and this and that. And she's like, and then there's a page where and her eyes got like so wide. And I was like, I know what you're trying to say. And she's like, but I just skipped that page and moved on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the kids, that's not how they're getting this information. You know what I mean? Like, and every educator I know, it's all over the internet. The memes are everywhere. If we could indoctrinate kids, it would definitely be to, like, pay attention and do their work and put their phone away and those things, you know what I mean? But I think that that's such an important thing. We can't, don't get me wrong, we have influence, and I'm glad I try to be a positive influence. But at the same time, they have so many other things influencing them and their identities and who they are. And, all we can help them do is feel seen, feel loved, feel appreciated for all of the aspects of who they are, because they may not have that other places. And, it's especially, again, mental health is such a crucial thing. And that's something I know I'm going to be talking about a lot, but it's like books, I don't know if you've seen the new season of Heartstopper yet, but
I haven't watched any of it yet. I've just read it. So.
Oh my, well, I'm sure it's just like this because I've read some of the graphic novels. I haven't finished it yet, but you see a student see himself in a book and all of a sudden go, oh, I'm not broken, and that's kind of a theme too on that show. There's a few, it hit me hard, kids that are like damaged and you're not really supposed to root for them because they hurt your main characters. But like all I see is like a kid who just needs to know that he's okay, who he is and how he is, because hurt people, and we know that. And so we want to help these kids be as well adjusted and well rounded and happy and emotionally healthy as we can while we have them, and books help with that. Books can be a positive escape, even when they're sad, even when they're uncomfortable, because that's, it helps them understand the world, because the world can be sad and uncomfortable and scary and hard and all of those things.
I think too, like there's definitely that. So one of my favorite books that was on the South Carolina Junior Book Award list a few years ago was called Revenge of the Red Club. And the Red Club is about periods. And there's this secret locker at school that has period products that nobody knows who stocks it until the end of the book. But the kids, they literally have a Red Club where they go and they talk about their periods. And there's a few books that I have that are like this. And it's really interesting because it's not something that you really talk about a lot at school. You might glaze over it in health class. But also, if you're only talking about it with a parent or an adult at home, that's one person's experience. So like a lot of times we end up talking with it with a lot of people, people can have periods that are way too extreme and they don't realize that they actually have a health problem until they talk to other people and they're like, oh, it's not supposed to be this bad. So I think like there's certain taboo subjects like that if you read about it in a book and you were one of those kids, you might be like, oh, maybe I should talk to the nurse about this, or maybe I should ask my mom more about this, or my parent, So I think there's just so many different things that kids can pick up on. And then, exactly. There's so many good books right now about grief, like either loss of a parent or this or that and the other. And I think it started before COVID, but now we even have some that reflect that. And so I think that's another really important thing for kids to realize is like grief doesn't have an end point because, it's like, oh, you get your week off. It's not all going to be fine after a week of being off of school. So I think there's just so many great ways for kids to see those different experiences and be like, yeah, exactly. I'm normal. Or I'm not abnormal, I guess. What is normal?
Right. No. Yeah, absolutely. No. Well, and by seeing all these different characters, all these different situations, and starting to see them all as normal, then it can help them with that idea that normal can be anybody, any situation, and we don't have to have this tiny little idea of it. Because I see my kids trying so hard to be this thing that they think they need to be, and I know that they're struggling, but they put on a tough face for their friends or whatever, and it's like books are a safe space. Books are something that can really allow those kids who may not be ready to talk about what's going on with them yet, or may not know how to, or may not even really realize what's going on with themselves. And then they read, and it's all of a sudden, it's like it's given words to their experiences. And that's so beautiful. And I hate to think about all these kids who are losing or going to lose that experience if we keep going down this path.
So one of my favorite things, and this is, so I started doing, some people call them reading sprints. We do, it's basically sustained silent reading. We were noticing because, we work with data as teachers. And one of the things that we noticed was that our students, when they would get to any kind of test, whether it was a diagnostic test or the state test, if they saw a long passage, they just would answer the question and click right through it. And so we were trying to think of some things that we could do. So we're like, well, we need to have more sustained silent reading time so that when they're encountered with a longer passage, they will read it.
Yes.
So just, we're intentional with our data. But so we started doing this in the library. When they would come, they'd get their book. And so we would read for, a chunk of time and then turn and talk to a partner and then read for a longer chunk of time just to get them to expand their reading time. Well, the side benefit of this for me was that everybody thinks librarians read at work. We never get to read at work, like literally never. But this was the one chance where I got to. And as I was reading, I realized a lot of these kids had probably never watched an adult read before. I know that sounds really weird, but like silently reading to themselves, because not everybody's
Right.
are going to do it. And if your parents more, even if they're reading a book on their phone, just like actually seeing an adult physically read it. And so
Yeah.
so many middle school books are filled with whimsy. And so there's a couple times where I laughed out loud and the kids are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, my book is really funny, you guys. Like, and it's okay to react to, and they're like, oh, I can laugh at a book. Like, so just like that thing, that idea of modeling actual reading for students is important sometimes.
I don't even think I'd really thought about that very much because, yeah, I ask them to read and sometimes I read to them or read, but I did, yeah, I mean, I'm not sitting there with a book either, you know, and
Yeah.
so I think that that's, even if you do have your kids reading, yeah, you're very rarely also reading with them. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was like my sneaky way. And then I was like, oh, wait, I just like finished a book in 2 days of work. This is awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it is very funny to me because, you know, I think a lot of our students think that like we just magically know all the things, you know, that like whatever I'm teaching you, I know it innately somehow. I just happen to like have channeled that. And I'm like,
I
y'all,
was
look at
on
my
Jeopardy.
computer. Okay, yes. Well, that's you. I have a garbage memory. I'm a social studies teacher with a terrible memory, but you know, I know I show them, I'll pull up my computer and I'll say, look at all these tabs I have open. Like I have to constantly be looking and learning and growing. And once you really start doing that, it's it's like lifelong learners. Like that's what they have to be. That's what we all have to be because the world changes too fast. And, you know, I know that that's so much of this backlash is it's scary. Change is scary. Change is hard. There's kids using words to describe themselves that you've never heard before. Everybody's talking about pronouns now. I don't like pronouns. What's a pronoun? Y'all, like, it's just basic grammar. Like, I know it might like upset some folks, but you know, it's basic grammar. It's okay. But I think it is really important for them to be able to see that, to be able to see that we are also still learning and growing. Like I'm not asking you to do something that I'm not going to do myself and won't do myself. And sometimes because I'm ADHD, I also actively do it during class. And I'm like, I'm sorry, guys, I know we're doing something else, but I just found this thing and I find it very funny and I want to share it with you guys. Because yeah, I want them to also feel like it can be fun, like learning interesting things and fun things and things you want to share with the people around you, you know? Because that's why I wanted to be an educator in the first place, you know? So yeah, I think
Why I keep
this is,
going to graduate school as much as possible.
listen, I have thought about it. I'm like, do I want to do school again? But you know, I might, we'll see. But so I know that there was an organization that you wanted to give a little shout out to before we get back to Skazzle and the Skazzle Dazzle.
So I thought I would give Hope in a Box a shout out. So they are this is an awesome organization that originally started. So they will send, it's mainly for lower income rural schools. Although it's funny coming from Charleston County, like Berkeley is technically more rural, although it's growing up all the time. But so I received a book pretty early in a box of books pretty early in the thing. So they can send a children's, a middle grade, or a high school box of books that feature queer main characters for either a classroom teacher or librarian to use in their library. For me, the really valuable thing was I got my box also like right when COVID hit, and we have this Educators for Hope group where we literally just get in a Zoom room once a month on Saturdays and talk. And so it was really a lifeline during that moment because we're all just like, what are we doing right now? Like no idea. But also talking about how we could support our youth. And it's really cool being in that group because there's, you know, like sometimes there's somebody from Kansas and California and like out in Clark County outside of Las Vegas and then, you know, the South. So there's people from all over the country. So sometimes it can just be really helpful to see what we have in common. Because a lot of times being that educator that's supporting queer youth or being that librarian that's fighting battles against censorship, it can be really isolating. So having that group has been really helpful. But it's really great too because you can apply to receive a box of books. Also, if you are a school district that is more well off, you can purchase a box of books as well. But then they also have resources for educators and study guides and with really good resources. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. And if folks want to, you should apply for some books because free books are always good.
Absolutely. So I know that there are a couple of asks from Skazzle.
Yeah, so we will have some more information coming out within the next 24 to 48 hours, but we would love it if folks could join SCEA, and that link is listed right here. It's been really encouraging. We actually weren't even the ones that started it. It was like a friend of ours who's like, why didn't you join? An associate membership is $15 for a year. So if you're not a librarian, if you're another subject area teacher, a paraprofessional, a community member, $15 a whole year. And that just enables you to really see our emails and get communications for us, but it's also just a tangible way to show support. We are also looking at adding some kind of just donate button if people don't feel like they need to go hard and be members, but it's definitely worth it. And today is Wednesday, and as of last night, since Friday, we had 140 new members, which just was really encouraging when we met as a board to be like, okay, because I saw people being on social media being like, oh, I'm going to join, and I'm like, I wonder if they did, and they totally did. So that was exciting. We also are going to have an email template that you can email to your school board, to the Department of Education, to any legislators, that just shows your support for librarians and what we do and what we actually do, not what's listed in that letter. And then we're also hoping to get one to be able to email your principal or superintendent or board member and give a shout out to the librarian at your school, or the librarians in your district. And we hope to, I'm the type of person where I don't think that we can fight fire with fire. Like, I can give you good sense arguments about these things all day, and sometimes folks are just not going to listen. And
Right.
So we also are talking about different ways where we can highlight, maybe doing videos. I was laughing because I was like, I remember back in the day we did Tumblr campaigns and would hold up a sign and do all that, and I'm like, what's the modern equivalent of that? I guess I need to ask a kid.
Yeah.
But the idea of either a librarian that changed your life or a book that changed your life, because we hear so many negative things about so many of these books. I'll give the example of, so my instructional coach talked about one of the most challenged books is Speak by Lori Halsey Anderson. And if you haven't read it, it is about a girl who was raped in between her 8th grade and 9th grade year during that summer. And she has a lot of issues when she goes back to school because her rapist is there at school. And so it's really about her finding her voice again. And it was based actually on Anderson's own experiences in her youth, and she later wrote a memoir that speaks to that as well. But my instructional coach was talking about how her son read it in high school and how profound of an impact it had on him, because he really didn't know things from the girl's perspective of stuff. And so it really helped him be like, oh, maybe I should step up in some of these situations to prevent things from happening. So stories like that, where it's like, okay, people are saying this book is vulgar and terrible, but like actually it can impact you for the better. So I think it would be really important to share those kind of stories, because we can all go to book looks and see how many curse words were listed in this book, but that's literally maybe not even an 1/100th of the entire book's content. That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny to me, especially teaching high school, and they're like, there's profanity. And I was like, oh yeah, is there profanity? I've definitely never heard any of that in a classroom or in a school environment. Like, y'all, listen, it's the world. We try to discourage it, or, the sexualization. I'm like, I spend all day, every day trying to like get my kids to like not ever say sexual, gross things. Like, it's deeply upsetting. And it's like, please stop. You were children. And because they don't have that context to understand how deeply upsetting it is for us as adults, because it's like, you're babies, y'all are babies. You may think you're grown. You may act like you're grown. You may, but for me, you are a child, you are a baby, and I need you to stop and just let's keep things very, and so it's so funny. But yeah, I mean, like, those books are important because unfortunately these bad things happen to kids, and that empathy, whether it's because it happened to you or just so you can go, oh, wow, that had never occurred to me. I didn't know people went through things like that. I had never thought about that perspective, and it's essential. I mean, we know it is. We know that it helps people and students and young people have a better understanding of the world around them and of the people around them, so that they can be successful. You're not going to be a successful human in this world, not long term, at least, if you don't know how to communicate with people and connect with people. And, well, I won't say you can't be, but it is much easier, but yeah.
that's something I try to communicate to students all the time, where I'm like, you may not like that person, but we're in class together this semester, so we got to make it work. And it's the same thing. Like well, luckily at my current school, I love everybody, but there's been schools I've worked at before where I'm like, ooh, I can't handle that person, but I'm going to make it work because I'm a grown adult and we're going to get through the day. So
Yep.
if you are in a job like mine now, where you're lucky enough to love everyone, yay. But that's not usually how it happens.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, and I think that that's important, and we have to have those conversations, and they have to see that. So is there anything you want to kind of tell folks before we sign this off?
I think the main thing is my whole thing with all of these situations is that in general, I think I'm thinking about how we talked about lifelong learning, but then also how a lot of times people will go from like 0 to 60, and it's like, I'm going to skip over steps A, B, and C. So I think if folks have questions, like ask librarians, like talk to the librarian at your school if you have questions about it. For us, I think at the school level, it's like, oh, when the parent goes straight to the principal before talking to the teacher, or, we have the parents that go straight to the superintendent before talking to the school. Just go through steps A, B, and C before we go all the way to D, please.
Absolutely.
And just, I think knowing more about how libraries work really benefit people.
And y'all, through CEWL, we have cool books run by a librarian with more videos if you want to know more about that. There's a lot of great resources that we have, and we're working on making even more, all coming from folks who are in the classroom, have been recently in the classroom. So this is not, anything that's coming from folks who are like, I used to be a teacher, but now I'm doing other stuff. And I think that that's important. So we've got our joint Scazzle. I want to say Scazzle Dazzle. The first time you said Scazzle, that's all I could think was like,
it's the best nickname ever.
I love it. I love it a lot. So I definitely appreciate that. So I appreciate you so much for joining me today. This has been a really great conversation, and I appreciate everybody who watched. Please help support the South Carolina Education Association, part of the NEA, the nation's largest union. If you are an educator in South Carolina, you do have a union, and your union counts, your union matters, your voice matters. And being there for these kids, speaking up. It's scary right now. It is scary. It is hard and it's scary, but we have to do it. There's no other time. There's just not time to lose. And so I hope that everybody will feel empowered and excited. And I hope that you will join me for my next video. And Loni, thank you so much for being with me today.
I'm glad to get off with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going to sign off here. So good night, and keep on learning, folks.